Brace yourselves, the storm is back. Poetic peeps and gentle persons, betweeners and nonconformers, genders all and genders equal, welcome to a whole new season of Eat the Storms, the poetry podcast. My name is Damien B Donnelly. As always, I get to be your host and producer, and thank you so much for tuning in today, tomorrow, or yesterday on your preferred podcast platform, whether that is Spotify, Apple, Google, Breaker, Podbean, Player FM, Overcast, Pocket Cast, Castbox, Podcast Addicts, iTunes, Amazon Podcasts, and now we're even on YouTube. We are back. Somehow we've made it all the way to the 9th season. We started somewhere back in what feels like a whole other lifetime, in the middle of the pandemic, when all we had was 5 meters and social distancing and silence and fear and anxiety and uncertainty. And for me, the podcast became a way to connect, to go beyond that social distancing. And somehow we made our way from here in Ireland over to England, over to Europe, and suddenly all the continents connected. And now, 4 years later, we're still making those connections, which are today possibly as important as they were in the pandemic, possibly even more important, because during the pandemic we had a virus that was killing us, and now those of us who made it through, regardless of where you live in the world, turn on the television every day and still see death, see destruction. This time, instead of a virus, it's a war, it's greed, desire for land, for ownership, for control. During COVID, we lost over 7 million people, but not all of us seem to have realised or recognised how fortunate we are and to cherish the life that we have inside us all. So starting off this new season, on this first episode, I'm going to take the next 30 seconds for all the lights we have lost. And now it's time to make new connections. My name is Damien B Donnelly. This is Eat the Storms, a poetry podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in, for listening, for celebrating the voices, our uniqueness and our diversity. Grab your tea, your coffee, your beers and your snacks. I hope you enjoy the show. And for my first guest on season 9, episode 1, we are off to India. So I get to have the delight of welcoming a first-time voice to Eat the Storms, but certainly not a first-time voice to my ears, as I have long been an admirer of her work. This year, she was nominated for 2 Best of the Net awards, one for her poem Libation for Mother, which appeared in Dust Poetry magazine, and one for her poem Chai, which was published by Black Bough Poetry, who will shortly be releasing her chapbook. She is a writer of myth and fantasy and a classical dancer. Her graphic novels, including Sita, Daughter of the Earth, are feminist retellings of epic Indian myths. And you may have read her work already in places like The Atlantic, Atlanta Review, Acropolis Journal, or Dust, to name but a few. I am so pleased to welcome to Eat the Storms for the first time, but hopefully not the last, Saraswati Nagpal.
Hi Damien, thank you for having me on the show. I love listening to Eat the Storms, and I'm really honoured to be featured in it. I hope your listeners enjoy my poems. India is synonymous with the monsoon. It is the one season we yearn for in the drier parts of the country. This poem is called Monsoon Serenade. Leaves promise a cascade of crystals tonight. scent of rumour ripples through dry brush, cracked soil, geckos haunt in ancient granite. In glades of longing rise peacocks' shimmering cry. Sky cracks open like a goddess's boudoir. Ambrosial silk spills. This poem was written from an experience with a young whale and his mother in the Atlantic Ocean on the west coast of South Africa. It was first published in the Atlanta Review in 2023. Of whales and love. Out past the bay she waits in deep water for her child, showing off his terns and plumes, his pearly barnacles, his purple southern right bod, and eye that winks at us, so close we could touch him, but squeeze each other's hand instead. Her rumbling moans from horizon, old hymns on cobalt lines, melting under hallowed sky. He flicks his tail, showers us in blessed brine. Some bird of wonder rises from my heart, dew-laden, wild, devout. This is how I love you, in awed silence and shining gaze, in fathomless trust. My next poem was born in the kitchen whilst I prepared a traditional Indian meal, particularly that spiced yellow moong dal that we enjoy in India. I realized that every woman in my lineage had probably spiced the dal in exactly the same way for generations. The act of cooking on that afternoon became a timeless bridge between myself and my great-great-great-grandmother and all the women in between. Ancestral alchemy. 100 voices travel through time and blood, through many wombs, to hum the wordless tune on my lips that dances on the kitchen walls. It is grandmother's eye that measures the cumin, and her mother's hand that sprinkles the salt. Her mother's mother stirs the lentils. Her mother slits the red chili and remembers the scent of fresh coriander in utero. With my fingers, she sifts rice. With my fists, she kneads dough. And when the red onions are sliced, it is my eyes from which my mother's tears flow. This poem is an elegy for my paternal grandmother, whom I called Margie. It's the memory of a dream I had 6 months before she passed, and then the final rituals that in my culture we perform ourselves as the family members on the morning of her funeral. Adieu, Margie. Final rituals. Through rusted night I carried you over a dream hill, vertical, crust like dried blood. Your gauzy frame, my laboured stumble, your hair a silver lantern in my arms. Then loomed the gateway carved of sky. Across a copper line of death you stepped, awash in honeyed river light, free at last. Here I rinse your body for the last time, comb silver hair, wipe grey skin in morning light, remember your smile. Dress a cold slab of trunk and legs in embroidered white. You are beyond flames now. These concerns of flowers and eulogies, those constraints of love and duty. In a river you pirouette at last, a wild bird in love with the wind. Spear Child. Before I grew ears was your voice, shiver on ectoderm, dawn in amniotic sky, silk in placental dream that split. I slithered out, the world a bright fuzz, your cries red with love and blood. I heard true north, your voice was starlight, fire, river, sun fed my bones. Your words grew me, grew inside me like fire seeds, and I became a forest of thunder, lightning in my tongue. My last poem for today is a poem about love, and it's called Hero. Pina coladas are served, but you continue to perambulate in the pool. Past goggle-eyed kids diving for pennies, young lovers smooching, and the fuchsia-clad selfie poser I'm rolling my eyes at. Onward you go, saviour of ditzy bees, drowning dragonflies, delusional spiders. Your tender cupped hands scooping them from despair to dry tile. In the end, isn't that love? To carry the fragile heart with gentleness from shore to shore, from cold delusions to the solid warmth of peace.
And now from India, we're coming back to Europe and settling down in my former home of the Netherlands. I spent 10 years living in Amsterdam, but for my next guest, we're heading to Rotterdam for a copywriter by day and a poet by night, with a BA in Arts and Culture Studies and an MA in English Literature. With German and Lithuanian heritage, she's grown up across many countries and therefore her work draws on her personal experiences as a third culture child, exploring themes such as identity, belonging, in-betweenness, human condition, grief and personal healing. She is a part of the We Are Strange Birds poetry group, and her work has appeared in places like Tenderness Press, Rev UU magazine, the Carried Away blog and Dicktober digital poetry bundle. It is a pleasure to welcome to Eat the Storms for the very first time, Paula Werdnik.
Hello to all the listeners. My name is Paula Werdnik, and I will be sharing a few of my poems with you today. A big thank you to Damien B Donnelly and the Eat the Storms podcast for having me on the show. My first poem is called Identity. I pronounce the words the way that my grandmother taught me. Ritas, Dona, Meados, Mishkas, Atzaprasho. Memories of childhood and language mixing like oil and vinegar, slipping away. My mother tongue, my first words. I find myself grasping, searching. The word comes to me, unsought, in English. Shame, like hot coals radiating through my stomach, caught at the border of belonging and not belonging. Confronted at last with how long I've been away, a whisper in my mind says, I wonder, do I belong here anyways? This poem was published in the Dichtober 2023 poetry bundle. My second poem is called Home. Can it be found between the covers of my passport, or in returning to the place that I was born? Could it be as simple as a place? I think of a house now owned by someone else, a city where old friends have long since moved away. I wish I had etched my name above my bed, to leave behind a sign that I was once there, to have been more than a guest in each place. My years scattered across the globe like stars in the skies, with each new friend an inescapable goodbye. Perhaps it is something which is created, not a place at all, but a feeling that we are forever chasing. This poem was published by Heart Locket magazine in 2024. My third poem is called Unlearning. I learnt from a young age that to be a woman is to be water, melted silver. To be a woman is to take the shape of your vessel, contorting myself into every shape, to be an extension of someone else's body, the first taste of not being enough. Their words like polished scissors, clipping our wings. This is what it means to be a woman. What could be more integral to becoming a woman than the process of unlearning the false truths that we were taught as girls? This poem was published in Raffia Gender and Diversity magazine in 2024. My fourth poem is called The Poet as a Deep Sea Diver. I dive for words like pearls in the vast blueness of my mind, searching within myself, bringing to light thoughts and feelings which have lodged themselves firmly in the tenderest part of my soul, germinating, growing, morphing. Art as an act of purging, a way of turning my thoughts and feelings into something which can exist outside of myself, capable of reflecting the world back onto itself. I wield the pen like a scalpel, an oyster knife, shuck my soul for hidden pearls, probing and prodding, as though round a sore tooth. In each poem, a single grain of truth, a piece of myself, almost hidden, made smooth by rhyme and repetition. Feeling lighter once it is out, having given words to the feeling or thought, I render it tangible, extract it with great care, like a bad tooth or a precious pearl. This poem was published in Review magazine in 2024. And finally, my last poem is called Mother Dearest. I cut the invisible umbilical cord with a shard of broken mirror. It had been tangled around my throat, depriving me of air until I turned blue in the face, keeping me small, disfigured, lopsided. An overgrown fetus in a vat of acid. Frankenstein's specimen of your creation, a patchwork doll of all your favorite parts. Your womb was my first loneliness, my birth was my first trauma. the violent splitting of the self from the mother. Yet, somehow, you kept me intertwined, dependent long after my time. You remind me so much of my younger self, you said. I cleaved, tore right down the middle of each cell, mitosis of the mind. Made every attempt to be more like you. I could only see myself through your eyes, living in constant fear that you wouldn't like what you'd find. My life became a performance. I played my role well. The good girl, the golden child. How I tiptoed and nodded and smiled. Lay flowers at your feet, danced till my feet bled, twirling until I couldn't breathe. Until one day, I grew tired of crawling on my knees. Grew deaf to your words, sour like curdled breast milk. I learned that I prefer honey over vinegar, the sweeter things in life. I look back into your precious mirror, now broken. My many selves look back. How have I never realized the beauty in all the cracks? I'm finally unlearning the fairy tale of who you said I should be. Taking my story into my own hands. This time around, I will decide my own ending. This last poem was published by the Ghoulish Gazette in 2024.
And more travelling is needed now for my next guest, another first-timer to Eat the Storms. She is originally from Westport here in Ireland in County Mayo, but she now lives in Vancouver, Ireland. So she's exchanged one West Coast for another. It's over there, between her son's nap times, that she enjoys mixing creative media pieces, eating cinema buns with her husband, and walking along the beach. Her mini chapbook, Crumbs and Constellations, is soon to arrive from Origami Poets Project, and her upcoming poetry collection, Someday, Somewhere Beautiful, will be published by Alabaster Leaves Publishing next year. With haiku already published in several journals, she's become a haiku workshop facilitator at the Sakura Days Fair in Vancouver earlier this year and has taken part in a number of spoken word performances. Today, joining us from Canada for the first time on Eat the Storms, I'm so very pleased to hand you over to Sophia Conway.
Hello, my name is Sophia Conway, an Irish poet from Westport, County Mayo, now residing on Vancouver Island in Canada. I'm so excited to have been invited to share some of my work with Damien Donnelly on the Eat the Storms podcast. This first poem that I will be sharing is from my forthcoming debut poetry book, Someday, Somewhere Beautiful. It's called The Circle of Life. Part 1. Meeting. I saw 90 years today, in the 2 feet between the strong and limber bones of my infant son and the endless shaking frame of his great-grandfather. They tuck each other in, he with more consideration than you, my boy. I could not tell if there was sadness or hope within his eyes to see his legacy arrive as his days grew shorter all the time. And what did you, my son, see in him? Was it all the potentials of life embodied here and now, or the dying of hope that no matter what we do, we still all end up here, shaking and afraid? Part 2. Joining. Life in all its fullness showed itself the moment your tiny hand reached across and curled around the withering bone of your great-grandfather. Your eyes both met across the years, and I swear I saw an understanding there in the brightness of yours and fading of his. He sat in his diapers, as did you, and was fed the same smooth and sloppy dinner by hands strong and calm. You saw your future, and he reflected on his past. This circle of life keeps spinning, and there's no getting off this ride now. Gurgles and mumbles later, he showed you his set of wheels, a wheelchair, and I showed him yours, a stroller. Two men light years apart in understanding, but somehow still the same. You will be him someday, as will I in my own way, and wonder what became of us. But when the future visits us as it did to him today, our spirits will be gently lifted, and we will feel hope again, and then hope for a long-earned rest. Part 3. Parting. Your great-grandfather passed away, 1 story down and 2 rooms to the right, from where I laid you on the floor and played with you at night when jet lag kicked us out of bed and your cries tied us to the toys. We didn't hear his last breath over your giggles and my yawns. We didn't feel his chest rise and fall for the last time over the softness of your new skin and that hard wooden floor. Maybe it would have been better for us to be asleep and we could have claimed ignorance that we missed it all in our deep slumber, but instead I wonder if we should have sensed a shift in the air when the house was suddenly one less that night. Perhaps it was better this way, for him to pass in peaceful isolation under soft cotton sheets to the apricot glow of the street light outside and the bubbling joy of his great-grandson above. When life was slipping out of reach, to be reminded that a legacy hard won continues in your son's son's son, and that while you greet your eternal sleep, the circle of life will keep spinning and spinning and spinning around. This next poem is called What the Raven Said, from my published novella, His Last Companion. I think I shall live forever, said the raven to the world. I feel infinite, matchless, there's a blue sky in my soul. I am a restless ocean, a spring bubbling up from earthly caverns. I shall not close my eyes forever, but build my nest among the stars, out of reach for all the world to see. Eternal sleep will not catch me, let no shadow cross my path. There is no end to me, I am truly free. Death heard the raven's boasts and for his pride plucked him from the sky, for many had spoken so before, and many after him would do so again. Thank you for listening.
And now it's time to welcome my very last guest of today's first episode back of season 9, and a very special guest it is indeed. And for this guest, it's time to go behind the storms for a little poetic conversation, and who better to join me for this episode of season 9 than the people's poet Rita Ann Higgins. During the pandemic, whilst appearing on Brendan O'Connor's RTE radio programme, he bestowed on her the title of the People's Poet, and last month Gill Books here in Ireland published a collection of her poems which she read on the radio show called The Long Weekend. And even after the pandemic passed, Rita continued to be a regular on Brendan's radio show and was a guest especially over those long weekends, hence the title The Long Weekend. Rita Ann is the author of over 12 collections of poetry, including Ireland as a Changing Mother, Sunnyside's Plucked, Philomena's Revenge, and Goddess on the Mervu Bus, which was published in 1986. She's also the writer of many plays, including The Colossal Longing of Julie Connors, The Empty Frame, and Face Liquor Come Home from 1991. She's been awarded the Patrick O'Donnell Award, several Arts Council grants, residencies granted by the National University of Ireland, Galway. And last month I had the honour of sitting down with Rita Ann to talk about beginnings, traditions, writing practices, and that new collection, The Long Weekend. It is now an absolute thrill to welcome to the podcast from Galway, Rita Ann Higgins. To begin with, before we get into the long weekend, one of the many questions that I've been asking poets throughout this series is about beginnings, is about how you first got into poetry. I suppose how it took hold of you. Now, having read some of your interviews and hearing you talk on Brendan O'Connor and his RT1 radio show, I understand that it wasn't until you had TB, I think in 1997, shortly after the birth of your first daughter, that you were tucked away in the sanatorium and books started arriving. You were reading Wuthering Heights and Animal Farm. And I was wondering, I suppose, what was it about those books that encouraged you? I know that you grew up in a household of 12 siblings, so I imagine at that time it was impossible to hear anything that was going on in your head. So, what was it that finally drew you into writing?
Well, you see, I could read, but I didn't see the point in reading. I thought, well, why would one read when one could be chasing boys or, whatever, what you do as a teenager. But when it was 1977, I was in the TB ward, and I don't know. I mean, I don't want to do any of this stuff about TB being mysterious or anything like that, but I certainly had a lot of mental energy. Now, that could have been the medication as well, because you're on a good old bit of medication, but it wasn't downer medication. It was eyes and eyes, and it was for the tuberculosis. But I found that my head, I was spinning, I was flying, the head was flying, but the body wasn't going anywhere, I was knackered. And this couple came up and they gave me Animal Farm, and that was pretty slim volume. But I didn't know what a mind-blowing book it was. I didn't know, there was no plan. You're going to read Animal Farm, then you're going to go on to Wuthering Heights, and they're going to be amazing. But that's what happened. Animal Farm was just phenomenal. I loved the revolution in it, and I loved the kind of a parable thing in it. And I just loved it. I just devoured it. I ate the storm there and then. And then Wuthering Heights, I went to night tech for a little tiny bit, but I started to read that book then, and I just couldn't understand how amazing the visuals were in it. I could see her, I could see him, and it was so sad and devastating, and the moors and the maid, the way the story was told. It was just quite extraordinary. So those two books were very significant. They were pivotal, really, in my journey into literature. And I never looked back.
But it's incredible because, I imagine sort of before that, 60s, early 70s, the church is huge, the Bible is huge, the sermons are big, and that's what, at a certain time, that's where you have most access to. Even when I was growing up, the bookshelves weren't huge, but religion was sort of the overriding force. But then suddenly, when you start to get away from that and you start to discover these other thoughts, these other books, these other storms.
Yes, exactly. And religion, we didn't have a book house. There was no books. There was the Far East and two religious magazines used to come in. The Far East was one of them, and the Messenger was the other one. They were the two magazines that came into the house. And I mean, I wouldn't read them, but there was hardly a time for reading. If you didn't see books there, why would it was more of a kind of a frantic running around, but loving life and loving being a child and loving the country. So books didn't come into it. So my journey was late and slow, because if you start reading slow, you're going to be a slow reader, because a lot of the words are hard. Certainly the Russians are really impossible to pronounce, but you kind of want the story, and this is all pre-audible. There was no way you were ever going to hear it, so you had to read it. But a lot of it stayed with you because it was so good.
Yeah.
When you did get a book you liked, you really went for it. And then and the poetry, then, to follow on to how I started, So after the TV award, it was like, will I go to a basket weaving? Will I go to basket making? Or there's a writer's workshop or a basket? What would I be doing in a writer's workshop? So anyway, I went to the writer's workshop and I met Jessie Lynn Denny. She was there. Jessie was, and her husband at the time they were Salmon, or she is the director of Salmon Public Poetry, and she was in that workshop, and her son was even there, and Fred Johnston was there, who passed recently.
Yes.
Yeah, Trish Fitzpatrick, who writes short stories, she was there, and it was just, I was in there was two rooms. There was a poetry room and there was a prose room. So I went into the prose room and I wrote a short story called Spot on the Lungs. And people were saying in the workshop, well, you're you're going into the past and the future and the present. Why are you jumping tenths? I didn't know that you have to stay in a tense, and that if you're writing prose, I thought, oh my God, I'm going to give this up. So then I went to the poetry workshop, which is in the next room. and poetry was, you didn't have to have a verb. Not that I knew what a verb was. It was much easier. And it's just nice people around you, and people are encouraging. And I found that I was encouraged there. And, and in June 82, I had the first poem published, and it was Dog is Dog is Dog. It was about the idea of people treating dogs as humans. You see, I'm nervous of dogs, so I'd have skin in the game, so to speak, because I wouldn't be able to understand. But I do, as an older person, I do understand well how people love animals. It's so, because I see it in my own. My daughters and my grandchildren. It's so essential. They give you back something. So that was the first poem. Yeah, and that was in the Salmon magazine. And then by 1986, I had my first collection, which was on the Merview bus, and that was published by Salmon.
That must have been an extraordinary room, like thinking about going into a room like that today with yourself and with Jessie and Fred. Like today, that's the most daunting thing. I think we'd all, as writers, we'd all come back out and think, well, no, we're never going to compete. But you were all there at the beginning, like a community almost forming.
That's it. And it was nice too. And we learned about, somebody said to me, did you ever read Emily Dickinson? And I said, no. So then I would go looking for Emily Dickinson.
Yeah.
And I was kind of puzzled with all these references to Greek mythology. So then I had to go and find out what was Greek mythology. So I got books from the children's library about the Aeneid and the Aeneid and the Iliad. And I just thought, mind-blowing. That and Bible, I always liked the Bible. So Bible stories, I liked that at school. I liked the parables and things. So then, so the mythologies kind of stuck with me because they're just fantastical, and you need the fantastical sometimes to tell the small truth,
But that's also, yes, and that's what's extraordinary. And like, I suppose we'll get on to the long weekend, but that's what's extraordinary, I think, about, and even Mom like borrowed the book, sort of stole the book the other day. She saw it there because I came back to Ireland. I've been away for 25 years, and during like the early sort of 2000s, I sort of come home, and over the weekend the family would gather, and maybe we'd have Brendan O'Connor on the TV in the background. His voice would be there, and the family would come and they'd see how I'd been doing, and they'd listen to me for 5 minutes and then tell the stories about nothing for the next 3 hours. But when I came back, then it was 2 months before COVID. I got locked down in the family cottage with my mum. Brenton's voice then was on in the radio in the kitchen on the Saturday and the Sunday mornings, and it became this sort of touchstone that I recognized, this sound that was familiar. And then because we were locked here in Luss, my mum and myself were sort of planning what we were going to do in the garden, when we were going to do the tour of the field that's behind us, because that was the limit. But then you came onto the radio and your voice then became the touchstone for us. So Mum recognized that immediately. But I think what she also recognized is you write in a way that, like you said, you take the mythical, you take even the mystical, you take the biblical, but you turn it into the everyday and you blend the two of them together. And that makes it very accessible in a beautiful way.
Well, thank you very much. And people do say, "Oh, I heard you on the Brendan O'Connor show." People don't mention any other program, even though I was on the Late Late Show a couple of times. So the visual isn't always the best medium. So like the oral, so they hear you and they hear the voice, and that suits me too. But no, that was like I got through COVID through doing the poems,
Mhm.
and then I was always in the past few years, I was a bit of a news junkie anyway, so I'd be tuning into everything and to go on your own comments, then mending it or melting it into something that was then turned out and accessible, but yet that the people could identify with. But I wouldn't have known when I'm doing it that the people would identify with it until later and later and later. And now, even at the theatre the other night, people were saying, "Oh, I heard you on the Brendan O'Connor." So that's what people say, and that's absolutely fine.
And what was it like? So just I suppose just to explain, so the long weekend now out with Gill Books. Brendan O'Connor has his RTE radio shows every Saturday and Sunday. During the pandemic, Brendan invited you on. He turned you into the people's poet, and you became not only sort of a voice that we all recognise, but sort of a voice for us as well. In these. So often in these sort of insane times where we didn't know what was going on, there was this familiarity and there was this something to take us away or to remind us of other things that had happened in the past. So this collection became something of a deadline. Like you were writing each poem for the weekend, which must be very different to writing a collection itself.
You see, there was a book of the pandemic poems, and that was Pathogens Love a Patsy, but that was back in, we don't mention COVID in this book at all, in fact. You know what I mean? It's weird that you do it, you're in it, you're saturated with it, but then you want to get out, you want to move away from pandemic. So then Gil contacted me and they said, and it's a long lead into this book. I've been in contact with them a lot over the past year, and so they wanted poems to celebrate events of the calendar, the Irish calendar year. So what I think I did was I was interpreting the past through the poems in the calendar year, and some of them I would have done with Brendan after the COVID. So he wasn't going to throw me to the winds or to the storm. So I still had an odd poem, and they would either the producer would ring me and say, "Have you anything?" Or I would send one. But then it kind of evolved into bank holiday poems.
Yeah.
So whereas I was nearly doing it every week for the pandemic, but then afterwards it was kind of bank holiday poems. So some of the bank holiday poems are in the new book, and then some of the new ones are in there, and other ones were brought in that fitted in with the brief of celebrating events in the calendar year. But the difference is they're kind of quite a lot from the first person singular, which isn't anything I've ever done. Do you know how they say, "Oh, the I in the poem may not be you," but the I in the poem is me in a lot of them in this collection. So that's very different for me.
Yeah.
And it takes in childhood, and it takes in adulthood as well. It's the whole shebang.
That's a funny thing because I think as poets we spend so often correcting people and saying, no, it's not about me. We're using the I, and then suddenly it comes along and you go, well, no, actually.
Yeah. And you see, readers of poetry never really assume that the I is you. I'd never assume the I was a person if I'm reading it in a book of poems, but I'm saying it now that a lot of the I is myself.
And you do like that. That's what's extraordinary, And I was reading it. I was reading again this morning. You take us through this journey through the year. From sort of starting off with the turkey walks after Christmas dinner to the epiphanies. These superstitions that are now almost fading, but that were so vital. And then these sort of everyday observations. The people wearing their coat, going outdoors to walk because it's sort of almost warmer outside than inside. Wearing their coats.
Yes.
The shame of St. Patrick's Day and not having the ribbon or that sort
And
of neighborhoods trying to compete. Like it takes us through so gently, but I think one of the overriding factors was that sense of, in a way, how much more you kind of almost had when you had less. Like I think the poem where it's set at Halloween, where the kids today are coming around with an open bag and they just want whatever you can give them. But in our Halloween, we had bobbing for apples and superstitions and songs and traditions that seem so lost today.
yeah, and when you're delving back into the childhood thing and you're writing the different type of poems, it really was a different world. Even though I feel young, I know I'm old. You know what I mean? I feel
Yeah.
when I'm going through them and I'm saying, but it is a different world. It's a faster world, and if I'm with my older grandson, he's always it's either TikTok or whatever is going on the phone kind of thing. Even though he's a wonderful young man and I get on great with him, but it's a different world. There's a different pace,
Yeah.
and whereas like back then you could observe, you could listen, you could you'd be a watcher, like you'd
Mhm.
be a watcher. And as you say about the Halloween kids have no rhymes and they don't sing songs, and they all just open the bag, and it's the saddest thing really in a way, because it's the death of another tradition to just die out, and we have to move with it, I guess, but I'm happy enough to remember it.
Yes, and it does, like, not to be sort of maudlin, but when I was reading back, and I was remember, like, I remember being sort of a child in the early 80s, and literally those things, the bonfires, the bobbing for apples. And the one thing that it struck me was community. And community today means being on X or being on TikTok, whereas community then was the person who was next to you physically.
Yeah, and if you like, and people on internet have thousands and maybe millions of followers, but sometimes if you find yourself, you're going to a funeral of someone, and then you say, well, there's very few people here. I thought that
Mhm.
person knew
Mhm.
everybody, and like that is the reality check of the whole internet thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the community in the new book is really the community in the country before I moved to my present address, because the neighbors all, one neighbor brought eggs, one neighbor might have brought buttermilk, you got butter from another neighbor. So like the sense of community and the sense of your mother telling you to look out for the woman who comes with whatever. Make sure you make her a cup of tea. There's all this kind of the continuity of community, and you look out for them, and they look out for you. So like there was an awareness of the people around me as I was growing up. I think of it like under Milkwood, that
Mhm.
kind of,
Yeah.
you see them, you know them, and still to this day, I really they're my fondest memories of those neighbors, and they were my mother's friends. And one woman would knit your jumpers. She
Yeah.
had a knitting machine. Somebody else would do something else. And
Yeah.
when I was going to the train the other day after the Brendan O'Connor show, a woman said to me, "Wait, I heard you on the radio, and my mother, when I'd get sunburned, my mother would send me up to your mother for your mother to put the Nivea cream on my legs." And I never knew that one. So that was another part of that whole community thing.
Yeah, comically enough, when I was a child, I went through one sort of phase of not wanting my toenails cut and not allowing my mother to let my toenails cut. I was about probably 3 or 4. But Bernie, my next door neighbor, Bernie Tunstead, she was allowed to cut them. So she would come in on a Saturday and she would cut my toenails. And something less revolting is that in the same way on the street, when an Irish stew was made in one house, it came around the other houses. When an apple tart was made for one house, even if there was 5 or 6 kids, it made its way around at least 2 or 3 houses.
Yeah. And you know what about feet? When our feet hurt, we hurt all over, Socrates said. So
Yeah,
good that your
yeah,
neighbor looked after your toenails. It's essential, it's important, and it's a nice treat as well.
yeah. Well, listen, speaking of locations and where we are, I always try and ask people about the writing process because I know the listeners are always intrigued in terms of, how we write, especially today with all this cacophony that's going on around us. As I've already said, so many of your pieces are reflections on what is going on what's happening in life, whether it's sort of, Ash Wednesday ashes, on prisoners in prisons to, that grey duck or the grey goose on aeroplanes with bad tan lines. But we do need to be able to take ourselves away to be able to put that down on paper. And I know you used to head down to Spiddal? You had a cottage in Spiddal where you wrote. Is it the same thing now, or?
No, I used to rent in Spiddal, but then rents changed and rents got higher, and that was the end of that. But I loved Spiddal actually because my father was from Connemara. I loved that direction, and I loved the landscape. But no, I do an awful lot of my work in my box room where I'm talking to you from now, and I sometimes use notes in my phone. But when if I think of something, I'll put it in as a note. But I like to do the first draft just to handwrite it, because the first draft would very, 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 very rarely be the last draft. So you'd start off with the handwritten one, and then the computer would be kind of the next stage, the second draft. You might open a Word document, but certainly not for the first one. And what I do is I'd be tinkering with it. For I wouldn't always know what I wanted. What do I want to say? And I'm in the funny position now that I'm after having a book out and I'm not writing because I'm doing other things. It's a funny hole to be in. But the box room. Generally the mornings I'm better. The brain is fresher in the morning, and I think it's a great exercise if you could look at a poem and say, I think I'll put that in the bin and tear it up and put it in the bin, because that's really good for you, because we don't want to do that. We want to hold on to them and think someday that you'd fix it. But some poems are unfixable. And that's the kind of a struggle you'd have at workshops. Not that I do workshops anymore so much, because it's hard going and it's usually 2 and 3 hours. But if you're able to part with something that you think is, might have potential, that's great for you as a person. You're growing there, and you're saying, well, Ara, it wasn't that good. It was a bit pretentious. I'll put it in the bin, and I'll start another draft, or I'll start again, or I'll do something different.
Yeah, I love that's good exercise for the listeners out there. That's fun. I really like that. I'm going to try that myself. Just got a couple more questions before I ask you maybe to read a couple of poems, if you would be obliging. I was looking back and listening to some other interviews, and my God, you have a diverse range of jobs in that you seem to have taken part in, from at 14 starting at local factories, the button factory, cutter in the shirt factory. I was a pattern maker for 25 years in the fashion industry, so I recall the sounds and the smells of what that's like. You went then to computer factory, news agents, although you seem to be giving out free cigarettes. And then by 21, you're selling Collier's encyclopedias with, bonus and some giant turkeys that don't fit in the ovens. These are already poetic beginnings. And then, as you said yourself, going off and getting distracted by jiving and smoking and falling in love. Have all these twists and turns, do you think that this is what eventually sparked the poetry, or are these just coincidences and part of the journeys of life?
It's one I don't really know the answer to, but if I like that, I can see something, I can think about it, I can overhear something. Overhearing is good to listen. You just hear something on the bus and you say, "Oh my God, how." I remember one poem, in the hairdressers, the hairdresser said, "Remind me I owe the till £3." This was ages ago, and it turned up in I Want to Make Love to Kim Basinger. It turned up in that poem. I couldn't make up that line. Remind me I owe the till £3. So if somebody says something that's really fascinating, you can't forget. You won't forget it. It'll impress on your brain. But I don't know. The thing about the jobs is I didn't stay in jobs very long. I'd be in the job, be happy out, and then I'd want to move. But it was a time when you could move. You could go to the buckle factory. You could go to the nut and washer factory. You could go to digital. A lot of the factories then moved out, you see, and they moved to other countries where they'd get the labor cheaper. And that then you learn from that too. You thought, oh, where did they go and why did they go? But you'd have to be you'd have an inquiring mind, I think, is if you're curious about things. Like I always said to Christy, oh, did you meet so and so and how was he? Is he better? And he can't understand the amount of questions that I'd want answers to that are seem like so nothing, but yet like it's the detail. It's the detail. Did they get the hip operation? How are they now? Did they, was it hard? Did they have to go to Derry? Where did they have to get the operation? Why do you want to know this? He says, I don't know why I want to know where a person got their hip operation, but in the scheme of things, it seems to matter.
You've mentioned in a number of interviews the difficulty of accepting praise, whether it's linked to your upbringing or whether it's linked to sort of religion. I think you said was never, ever praise yourself or die 1,000 times with shame when someone else praises you. Now, I wonder, has that changed over time? Have you been able to accept the compliments, the success?
I was at the town hall the other night and I just bumped into Tommy Tiernan and Yvonne, his wife. They were outside just at the break.
Yeah.
I was on my own, so I went for a little walk. And then when I was walking, I have no issue about going to theatre on my own. I doing it for years. And Christy used to go, but he isn't great on the old pins at the moment. He's one waiting for surgery. So Yvonne said to me, you look fantastic. And I thought, oh, no, it's okay. No, I couldn't hope that. But then when I was leaving her, I said, you look fantastic. But she could cope with it. But I couldn't cope with it because it was too, you know what I mean? It was overwhelming to think that you looked fantastic.
Uh-huh.
Isn't that mad? That is the residue of your Catholic past.
Yes, yeah, because I was reading some people and like those amazing lines in some people, like you used to be second-hand, second class, no class, to be looked down on, to be walked on, to be pissed on, to be shat on, and yet what, 11, 12 collections later, stage plays, screenplays, and a career that's spanning decades, but still getting stronger and stronger and still continuing and still being vital. I think, it's time to say, yes, I am fantastic.
Oh, no, I mean, it's guarded available into Hain. It's an Irish shanachal about, let other people can praise me and I'll take it from other people from a distance. But no, I don't want to be praising myself. I'm learning, though. I'm getting better because it's easier on the poor creature who gives you the compliment if you can take it and not be mortified with shame at the fact that somebody said something nice to you.
That's true. Well, listen, can I ask you to read a couple of poems from the long weekend for us?
Okay, I'll start with a short one. All Souls Day. Novembers were dark and the responsibility was great. You had to get the souls out of purgatory. Write their names down, no matter how distant a relative they were. Be sure and place the list in the altar cavity where God's messenger on earth would find it. He loved a game of hide and seek. Always be afraid. Have guilt and shame in equal measures. Don't forget to pray and pray. You have a responsibility to the souls in purgatory. You are 8. Don't let others sense your fear. Pray more. Don't leave anyone caught in the flames. So that's All Souls Day.
Religion scared the youth, scared the bejesus out of the youth, no?
Yeah.
There
was a lot more religion. See, we don't have that, and our kids wouldn't have had that. And this one now is one from Spiddle that I probably never read. And Christy is in so few poems, but he was in this one, Fahrenheit. A cloud drapes itself over Turpiog, nearly sending me under the table. Last night the clocks went back an hour. I say obvious things like, it will soon be dark at 4 and other mundanes. We can hardly walk the bog now. I feel like Iris of the lost rainbow, spoiling for a storm. I can hear you shouting at the horses on TV. You don't hear what I'm saying, but you reply anyway. Yeah, it was a rotten year for blackberries. When the summoned gusts blow down the boreen and rip the buttons off your shirt, you'll care then. Your widescreen in the ditch. Aeolus comes without Plomos, loyal windbag that he is. The squall gains strength, galvanized roofs, loose teeth, chattering jaw joints, ice sheets and whirlwind, a Connemara cyclone.
He may never read it, but at least he's made it into the poem, I think.
If you want me to read another short one.
Yes.
Okay, the bees are coming. Didn't we miss lots of seasons that time? Wasn't it mostly dark and darker? The sameness of things was hard to stomach. Snowdrops, daffodils and crocuses gave us colder days, but we loved their coats and colours. Now you notice the morning light getting earlier and earlier. The birdsong is welcome. You nearly hold your breath to listen. You never knew nature and the seasons meant so much. The buds are peeping and popping. Cherry blossom with its pink gush and blush is ahead of you on all journeys, pickups and drop-offs, walks to the local beach. The tadpoles are busy. The caterpillar move is slow, but it is on. Entire families of them. The bees are coming, looking for nectar. We are nicer, looking for nectar too. We are smiling. Hope is hanging around. Seedlings are sprouting. Spring is here.
We are looking for nectar too. Rita Ann Higgins, the People's Poet, thank you so much for joining us on the first season back of Eat the Storms, the Poetry Podcast. It has been an honour.
Pleasure was all mine, Damien. Thank you so much.
And now, just before we finish up today's episode, I'm delighted to welcome two special guests. And these guests are here specifically for Rita Ann Higgins, and they are going to each read a poem of hers. First up, I'm delighted to welcome back to the podcast one of my favourite guests who joined me last season for one of our Behind the Storms chats, the wonderful Anne Tannham. Anne is currently poet in residence at Poetry Ireland, and her collections include Take This Life, Tides Shifting Across My Sitting Room Floor, 26 Letters of the New Alphabet, and most recently, The Extraordinary Dismantle. This is Anne Tannham.
A beacon from Mars. Phase 1 of easing the restrictions is a bit frightening. Find 4 people and talk to them in the middle of the road. You don't have to know them. In fact, it's better if they are strangers. Don't bring them into your house. Don't roll around on the chrysanthemums in the garden centre. People will think you are weird. Be totally confused about homeware and hardware. If you are a hardware shop and you have homeware, it's a win-win. On the other hand, if you are a homeware with no hardware, then look in the window of the hardware shop and cry. Face covering can be anything from a dishcloth to a duvet. Don't say mask. Never say mask. Don't be tempted to run into other shops without thinking. A sugar rush today without your balaclava or your blanket could mean a stay in ICU tomorrow. Don't do it. The Leaving Cert is cancelled. Calculated grading is in. Teachers are under pressure. All contact is forbidden. If you happen to see your teacher on the prom, don't say, "Do you gwitch a muintir?" That could be viewed as canvassing. Just keep looking into your shoes and mind the bollards. The teacher tension was knitted as tight as fishing gut covering a gully. Student tension was tighter. Outside the chaos is more chaos. Mammograms are not happening, neither are cervical checks. Childcare, who care, why care, no care. But there is a ray of hope. It might be safe to let the children back to school soon. Then again, it might not. The meat factory workers stand shoulder to shoulder. Where do we stand? As long as our sirloin is on the plate, do we really care? More onions there, love. The tourists will be coming soon through our common twilight zone, bringing the virus in their pockets. The advice we were given in March is flying in the face of our isolating sacrifices. The roadmap to recovery is flashing like a beacon from Mars. Contact tracing is more myth than menace. The systems don't talk to each other. The graph says we think it's over. It's not over till the coronavirus ends, and the virus has more heads than the Hydra. Be careful with the Hydra. When one head dies, two heads live.
And now I am very excited and very pleased and delighted to welcome the final guest to surprise Rita Ann. The collection that we were celebrating today is The Long Weekend. And the reason it came to being, the reason Gill Books published it, it's because of Brendan O'Connor and his RTE radio show on the weekend. So here, to play us out today, for Rita Ann Higgins, this is Brendan O'Connor.
Some people know what it's like to be called a cunt in front of their children, to be short for the rent, to be short for the light, to be short for school books, to wait in community welfare waiting rooms full of smoke, to wait 2 years to have a tooth looked at, to wait another 2 years to have a tooth out, the same tooth, to be half strangled by your varicose veins but you're 198th on the list, to talk into a banana on a job search scheme, to talk into a banana in a job search dream, to be out of work, to be out of money, to be out of fashion, to be out of friends, to be in for the Vincent de Paul man, to be in space for the milkman. Sorry, Mammy isn't in today, she's gone to Mars for the weekend. To be in Puerto Rico this week for the blanket man, to be in Puerto Rico next week for the blanket man. To be dead for the coal man. Sorry, Mammy passed away in her sleep, overdose of coal in the teapot. To be in hospital unconscious for the rent man. St. Jude's ward, 4th floor. To be second hand, to be second class, to be no class, to be looked down on, to be walked on, to be pissed on, to be shat on. And other people don't.
And so, as always, just before I leave you today, I'm going to offer up one poem. And this time, as we've had a truly international podcast, I'm going to read a poem about my homecoming, having been away for 25 years. So this is from my latest collection, Back From Away, which was published earlier this year by Tourist Press. And this is called Homecoming. 1. We pack everything with bright bows, trim fat from all that has gained. Fold future pockets of storage into careful corners. We'll unwrap later in rooms that knew us long before we divined how to step out. We bask in the depths before wave brings us back in. 2. We barely squeeze through doorway. Push boxed lives under beds that shrank since we left the protection of their blankets. Our feet stick out, and the morning air is frostier than dream afforded. Coast has grown cold. Memory latches like mould to all we've brought with us. 3. We rescale the dream into dissolvable pieces, unpack only in part, only what they can swallow. in this place unmoved since our departure, unaware of all we drank of the ocean. We denounce claim to exotic, and into carefully packed corners of storage, place all the meals we ate once at foreign tables. Home, where we unpack only what's acceptable. Poetic peeps and gentle persons, in-betweeners and non-conformers, genders all and genders equal. We've reached the end of this very first episode of Season 9 of Eat the Storms, the poetry podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name has been Damien B Donnelly. I've been your host and producer. Thank you to you, the listeners, for tuning in on platforms like Spotify, Apple, Google, Breaker, Podbean, Player FM, Overcast, Pocket Cast, Castbox, Podcast Addicts, iTunes, Amazon Podcasts and YouTube. A huge thank you to my terrific guests on this truly international episode, and they have been Rita Ann Higgins from Galway here in Ireland, Sophia Conway, formerly from County Mayo but currently in Vancouver, Ireland in Canada, Paula Werdnik, tuning in from Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and enchanting us all the way from India, we had Saraswati Nagpal. And of course, my two special guests on the show today have been Brendan O'Connor and Anne Tannum. So if you like what you heard on today's show and you want to find out more about these fantastic creators, then head on over to www.eatthestorms.com, and there on the website we have a podcast section called Listen to the Podcast, and for every episode there is a blog post with bios, photos, links to their social media handles, to their websites, to where you can find them, be their fans, follow them, and of course perhaps even buy their collections. Now, while the podcast may have been off air in between the seasons, the producer certainly wasn't. It's been a busy time. I've been curating, editing and designing issue 4 of The Storms, our journal of poetry, prose and visual arts, and this time I had the joy of being assisted by sub-editor Fiona O'Rourke, a regular here on the podcast, who joined me for this special edition. This time we have been supported by Dublin UNESCO City of Literature, care of Dublin City Council, and also Fingal Arts, care of Fingal County Council. And the new issue of our printed journal will be launched in our Gillen Castle on the 10th of November, and I cannot wait to share it with you all. The theme for this issue is Dublin Days, from city to shore and across the sea, and I think this time we've managed to curate a collection of voices and visions that stretch back almost 100 years, back to Marie Curie interviews in Trinity College, and incorporate the new voices who have just joined us here in Dublin, in Ireland, seeking shelter, security, a new place to call home, and offering us a new vision of life, of living together, of our diversity. This issue is of 1 city and 93 artists, and it's coming very soon. Now, if you're looking for a little bit more of me, then I suggest you head on over to the Red Line Book Festival. I'll be there in Tala next Wednesday, where myself, Gustav Parker Hibbett and Linda McKenna will be in conversation with Patrick Deely, talking about our new poetry collections. But for this episode, that's all from me. We'll be back with you again next Saturday, although we're a podcast, so you can decide to tune in whenever you fancy and on whatever podcast platform you desire. Until then, be bold, be brave, be bright, be open to opportunity, diversity and the artistry that is alive in every one of us. My name's been Damien B Donnelly. This has been Eat the Storms, a poetry podcast, and until next time, well, you know how we end every episode. It's the 9th season by now, so all together, stay bloody poetic.